Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. This session is going to focus on bringing Agile project management to government demands. So I know some of you, I see familiar faces, joined us in the earlier session, which was more of a DevSecOps discussion. For this dialogue, we'll dive a little deeper into the people and process side. So I'd like the esteemed members of our panel to take a few minutes to introduce themselves. So Brian, if you don't mind, can we start with you?
So my name is Brian Doan. I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. Excuse me. I'm with the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, and I'm the Deputy Chief Technology Officer. Thank you.
I'm Laura Gerhardt, and I'm with the Technology Transformation Services at the General Services Administration, and I'm a technical lead and developer.
Hi, I'm Henry Chow. I recently retired in 2015 as the Deputy CIO of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
I'm James Chan, and I'm officially jealous of Henry. But I work for CA Technologies, and I'm one of the leaders in the Agile Management Business Unit.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Bush. I'm retired FBI. My last job was the Assistant Director of the Criminal Justice Information Services Division out in Clarksburg, West Virginia.
Great. Well, let's start with an easy question. So Laura, we'll start with you. What does Agile mean to you and your organization?
So it's funny, when I think about the definition, every time I feel like I come up with a new insight in it, I go back to the Agile Manifesto, and it's right there. And it's sort of a succinct and beautiful thing, and I think it really gets key toward a few things. It's really about people over process. It's about customer over contract. And thinking about in those, in an Agile training I took, that it really is the over. They both exist, but it's also sort of mitigating that and recognizing there are times that you want to place one over the other, and sort of the manifesto itself gives you a guidance into that throughout. And I think the other thing that's really sort of key toward it, it's kind of in the name, is really the continuous improvement and looking at a reflection and taking those reflections, having the space for it, and incorporating what you glean from those reflections into your process going forward.
I'm really glad you went first. You did a great job.
James, I know you have a perspective on this.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with you in the fact that people are the core of agility. But I think one of the things that we've kind of learned too, just in working in the field with many clients in different agencies, is that doing Agile is not being Agile. And I think those are very different things. In the fact that it's kind of giving people guidance in terms of where we want to go, right? That's the direction, right? And allowing them to iterate in terms of how we get there. So it's not just about methodologies, but also achieving outcomes. And the other thing too that I hear a lot about is the ability to kind of inspect and adapt, right? So, kind of welcoming failure. And I kind of have an interesting perspective on welcoming failure, right? Because I think failure in and of itself, for failure's sake, probably not that good. But failure in terms of being able to learn on how you get to where you need to go, that's important as well. So it's kind of being able to adapt and really achieving those outcomes we set forth in a more timely manner.
And Henry and Tom, could you share your perspective on what an Agile approach or an Agile methodology would have meant to your organizations when you were responsible in running them?
Well, I think what Agile does is that it opens up a kind of a conversation with everyone in the IT and business organizations to talk about how do you achieve it. It isn't just something you wake up one day and you take a training course and people have titles and positions and you're ready to go. I think there's so much technical debt that many organizations carry. I think they have to have a conversation and take a close look at just how agile they can be in the context of how they have to move the entire organization and all of its IT and infrastructure and policies and everything that they've invested in as they go forward. It's a more kind of pragmatic approach. I think if there's overemphasis on the term and the newness of it, people would prefer to not have to think about all that messy old legacy stuff you have to deal with. But I think, in being truly agile, you really have to have the conversation about all the, there's a term bimodal or two-speed IT. I think in CMS, it was more like, 20-speed IT, with every sub-organization doing their own thing. So you really have to think about the enterprise view in terms of Agile.
And I think that's a really good point. The CGIS still uses LCMD, lifecycle management. So that's great for building battleships, and we're really good at that. And we were building, when I was there as the assistant director, we did redid our biometric capability, $1.1 billion, and we successfully completed. We built an information sharing capability of over 400 million. So all these new capabilities were being done, but we were doing them the old way. And I'd say we were successful. We did it through brute force. I mean, they say you can't put a square peg in a round hole. They did it and they got through it. But could we have done it so much better? And could we have done it, and like you mentioned, failing early and I think failing often, I think that's so cool. And so the stuff that I see now with DevOps and security, and could you have done that in tandem with your development while we were doing this instead of waiting until the end of these increments and maybe a couple of years as we were doing these big integrator long-term projects. And so could we have built that so much faster, failed early, and learned from that, and then gone and fixed it and moved on, did the security piece while we're moving forward? I think it would have been a beautiful thing to have seen.
So you mentioned failing early and failing often. So Brian, what's your perspective on ways that we can encourage people to take risk as part of the transition to Agile, and how that can help drive innovation and velocity?
It's a great question. So one thing, so usually people only focus on the negative within the U.S. government of how you can execute or what you can do or not do. Here, let me talk about one benefit, is that usually within the federal civilian U.S. government, unless you are an acquisition decision authority that you are, and therefore mean that you are the program manager, and they usually, although you would expect down the outside that you have, a project manager, program manager, et cetera, but in the inside of government, many times they don't allow us to even name somebody as a project manager or program manager if they aren't the acquisition decision authority individual. So I actually think it allows people to be able to fail fast and fail more often because they're not the program manager. So if you identify for them that if they do X within this period of time, and since they aren't the acquisition decision authority, then this is acceptable, and it allows you to be able to move forward on that. So it's just to say, I'm absolutely in support of it. Do I find techniques outside of even what I described which work all the time? Not necessarily, unless there's some new task force to where people have come together and they said, here's a task force, not a working group to where your success, metrics are you coming together and having a meeting, but to come together in terms of something which can be an outcome. And, I usually find that big events, including, industry events that might be coming up, is both interfacing with government to give them the opportunity of saying, what is an announcement you'd like to make then, and then seeing how can you use Agile in between now and then to be able to execute. And I have a few examples of how we've been able to do that, but the gist is we've got to make things much easier. Usually people are scared to death about losing their job is what it comes down to, and that's not a good environment for Agile no matter where you are. Thanks.
So James, what are some of the ways that you've worked with agencies and customers to help tie outcomes to delivery?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, because I think one of the things that organizations and agencies are looking for right now is this accountability for outcomes, right? I can even recall, I think last year when Obama put in the PMI-AA Act that talked about program management, improvement and accountability. It kind of really said, okay, for the dollars that are being leveraged in different programs, how do we prove back that we're providing value back to our citizens? So I think, there's a couple of things. There's that financial governance piece, but there's also that continuous feedback back into our citizens to kind of say, okay, these were our goals, and this is how we're going to iterate and deliver things sooner to you, so that you can actually see the value that your tax dollars are kind of going to as well in a much quicker manner, rather than waiting for these long programs to finish And guess what? The goalpost has now shifted, right, in the minds of the citizens as well as what their outcomes are. So by kind of leveraging Agile delivery, even within those programs, allows us to get closer to our citizens, get feedback, and provide value a lot sooner.
And just an open question to all of you. What are some of the things that you've seen that help drive success in agencies as they adopt Agile and Agile practices?
Can I go back to what he just mentioned, is know who your actual customer is. Because there is times where, absolutely our customer is going to be any U.S. citizen or all U.S. citizens, but many times that's not necessarily the stakeholder group every single time. And as long as you know that initially, then you can start to provide value. What's been scary for me, and it's both the negative and the positive of it, is when people did not understand who their stakeholder groups were, whether that was just inside of a department and agency or across the entire federal civilian U.S. government, the state, local, territorial, government, then they just didn't know how to execute. So they were always right and they were always wrong.
And I think that gets to sort of a misconception about Agile, that you're not like generating requirements on the Agile projects and the Scrum teams I'm on. We're engaging with those users and probably requirements gathering about 3 hours a week or more. So it's just happening in an iterative process within the process of the actual development of the project. So we're focusing on both the higher level, where do we see this in a couple quarters, as well as the day-to-day. What do you think about this particular thing? We're showing them the actual product. They're giving their feedback, so it's not after your rollout that you're getting all this negative feedback. You're getting it there. It's the adapting there, and since it was a small change that your developers are familiar with how to change, they can tack accordingly. And then that you're moving it forward as a complete package of software in a 2-week chunk, in a month chunk, rather than, that longer iteration. I think the other thing, in addition to demos, one thing that we work with a lot of different agencies out of TTS that is really finding, even if you're not a software developer yourself, a business owner, akin to what you said, who can sort of represent those customer needs. And if they're not directly engaged in influencing the prioritization of the functionality that you're looking for, you're going to fall into the same processes because you're not going to have that sort of feedback from them, and to them to sort of communicate, this is the highest value, this is what's going to best achieve our mission objective, and they need to sort of represent all the stakeholder groups while, and culling feedback from that end customer is really what we found to be the key, probably the most successful thing in our work with bringing agencies toward a more agile process.
I think that for the 21 years I was at CMS, I always longed for the project that fits well in terms of your concepts, and as you go to implement, you stay in this nice little neat environment and ecosystem. And every time I was disappointed, and my career was kind of capped with the launch of healthcare.gov, and having 42 months between law and open enrollment, to 45 regs, to hundreds of stakeholders in all the states and all the Medicaid programs. You really have to assess what you're walking into and constantly adapt. I think the key to remain agile is that someone has to be the adult, and someone has to say, you can't do these things before you do these things. And if you want to get these requirements in place, I need to know these other things too. And while they're doing that, for many years, I think a lot of IT folks were shy in terms of coming out and stating, where that line is, because, after all, business is supposed to drive IT. But when business is massively parallel and a little dysfunctional at times, not that IT isn't, if you follow that kind of model, you'll wind up being just like that too. So you have to really think close about infrastructure, network, capacity, design, to the extent possible. And 42 months is not a lot of time to work on a program so large. And you have to then decide what are those increments that you can build, so that on day one, what we called it was the race to the starting line, not the race to the finish line. day one is when you launch with minimum viable, kind of capabilities. But from that point on, you're stabilizing, you're doing emergency fixes, you're remaining agile, and you're doing, what I call, DevOps on acid, really, because you're taking things out of production every day between 12 and 8 and then putting it back in production. It's really, really a hairy exercise, but you do these things and you keep things under control, you don't panic, and you keep on thinking about, what is that increment you must build to either deliver capabilities, to fix a capability, or to improve a capability.
Yeah. And I would just like to add one thing from a people process perspective as well as, I love change. Who doesn't love change? Right? So one of the things too is as organizations, as agencies are transforming to kind of be more agile, we also need to consider the people aspects of change management. And I think one of the things that we kind of coach some of our agencies, as well as on the commercial side, some of our clients on, is to really even have a transformation backlog, right? Kind of understand from a people and process perspective, what are the considerations and how do you build a roadmap around transformation? I think that's also important as well.
And so the CGIS division knows its customer base really well, 18,500 law enforcement agencies, and they're national security systems. They can't go down, they can't fail. They have to be available to that officer on the street. They have to be, they have to be on time, and they have to be available. So we do a really good job of building all our requirements from our user base. They're actually involved in it, and it's a pretty cool operation. I didn't like it at first when I first went there because I basically had the attitude that nobody tells the FBI what to do. And, but after I looked at it for a while, it took me about 6 months or so, I said, wow, this is really cool. They decide what they want. We don't build something and then put it out there and say, look what we, what we made for you. And so that part's really good. But, every 6 months we have these meetings where they come up with new requirements and they rate them, high, medium, low. But we're so backed up on that. So that's the good thing. We do a really good job gathering requirements. We went out and I talked about those systems we built. We slid to the right. And by the way, do those charts ever slide to the left? I think I've never seen one go that way. But anyway, we slid to the right because of the requirements gathering. So we did really good on that. But it's I was recently out with CA at CGIS and we were given the Agile presentation, and the development guys really got it. They really wanted it and they want to do it. But we were trying to talk scale, so then it was the ops guys, the people that are actually going to inherit it, and they were like, a few of them did show up, but they're like, not so fast, we're not buying this. So we can do all this really cool development on this end, and then these folks want to do 6 weeks of regression testing on everything, every piece of code that changes, and just drag things to a screeching halt. So it's a cultural change. James talked, I couldn't agree more. It's a mindset, and they're super risk averse. So how do you get over that? And, maybe just taking some smaller projects and biting that off and say, hey, let's run this thing in an agile manner. And they say they do agile. They chunk up stuff and they call it adaptive agile. They make up terms, and I said, I've never even heard of that one. Oh yeah, that's one. I go, okay, whatever. But so they believe they do it, but they don't. But they want to do it, and I think they see the value in doing it because you talk about they want us to develop things. OMB, you need to have a finished product at the end of a budget year, a budget cycle. You can't be saying, hey, we're 5 years out. We got 5 increments, and in 5 years we'll have this thing. Well, what happens if you run out of money at year three, and you have nothing but a bunch of pipes? And you can't do that anymore. You've got to deliver within a budget cycle, and that's where I think this Agile and DevOps and the other tools, the PPM, the other things like that really come into play and can make a big difference.
Right, and I think to your point, even with speed, right, even from an experience perspective, I have 2 teenage daughters, right, so you guys know what's going on there.
That's another whole story.
Yeah, that's another whole story. But it was interesting, kind of interacting with them and the apps that they've kind of forced me to kind of use, like Snapchat and all that kind of stuff. It's interesting that I think for the first time, the applications that I use at home are probably more consumable than the applications I use in my workplace. And I think the expectation actually in the workplace, regardless of who our clients are, is that they want that same experience and they want it fast. So I think with Agile allows us to satisfy those needs as well, to kind of bring that back in.
So Tom, you talked about a couple of challenges that you encountered. So let me ask all of you, what are some of the obstacles that you've run into or your organizations have run into, and what are some of the ways you've been able to successfully navigate those?
One for me that I've seen is where so it's helpful now that people are using terminology or phraseology such as technical debt, right? So that we can all at least describe that here's, some people might call it gap analysis of here's where we'd like to be and here's where we are. Sometimes even people starting there of showing that they have a gap, they feel is a failure on their part, or is potentially a fireable offense, both within the contracting space as well as within the government. And that's the exact opposite of why we work so hard, at enterprise architecture for so many years. So I think one is both helping people understand that it's okay to, have a technical debt and have gap analysis and have gaps. And actually that's what should be, further represented in your out-year funding of what are you trying to do, including in what period of time. Since you brought up, the funding thing and trying to execute within a fiscal year, and if you assume most years you're going to have a continuous resolution, maybe I should be a little bit more positive. I'll work on that. But let's say, you have how many months to be able to execute, both to understand, what you want ahead of time. And let's say you're even planning 3 years ahead of time, so you're in alignment with doing your 3 years out budget, and then executing within that one budget year of maybe 8 months is on a good day that you might have. That's really, really difficult. I like the concept more of 2-year base year, so that you can have 2 years to be able to spend your funds, separate than even execution of how many option years or other things you might have or other options. Doesn't have to be a year. But just having, I think it's called the 0-year PRs or otherwise, where you can have funds which don't expire either till you've completed what you said you're going to do, and that you've shown Congress of that, or Congress doesn't believe that you're executing in alignment with the money that they gave you. I think that's a fantastic opportunity both for us to be more accountable as well as allow people to execute more and to be able to use more Agile concepts and execution. Because even within DHS, they signed an Agile first policy. I was very impressed that they moved forward to that execution, including they helped level 1 programs, the largest programs that DHS have, to understand that whenever you come forward every quarter, including with the deputy secretary in the room, you're going to have to show your accountability for are you executing in alignment with Agile processes. Well, if you have a level 1 program, that's a very large program which has all these sub-programs and sub-projects. And to then ask somebody, are you using Agile? Well, it would be easy, it'd be very easy for them to respond either yes or no, is either right. But then, how can we ensure better transparency that you had brought up and allow people an understanding of how can they better leverage, the technical solutions and, capabilities and people that exist outside of even DHS that could allow us to do secure DevOps. And I know that, there's an article even earlier this week that showed whenever we try to do DevOps internally and where we had a few challenges there on that front. But so certain things are working well. There's a lot of opportunities of how to improve.
So partners play an important role in all your organizations. Could you talk about some of the benefits as well as some of the challenges of working with partners as you adopt Agile methodologies? Laura, we can start with you.
Sure. I think one of the things that sometimes we're working with agencies as sort of other agencies as a liaison, sometimes we're also working with our own to work with industry as well as the agency partner. And I think in some ways there's a little bit of a change in the nature of relationship when you're working with industry in an Agile fashion, that there's sort of an expectation sometimes from the government to get everything done immediately, and then they're not doing sort of their good work in terms of prioritization, what is the key functionality. And then sometimes I think the industry is overeager to please and maybe not communicating with the honesty that they need to about this is our ability to deliver this now. And so I think it's sort of, creating the trust in the organization, in the team that you're working on for these projects, for the industry to sort of better communicate their capabilities about delivery in a certain time frame, and government, on the flip side, one, sort of communicating what is highest value for our mission and objective now so that the industry can focus on that, and then sort of working together to sort of really flush that, what that means, while continuing to engage the customer throughout the process.
I think that the federal government itself can really work on key partnerships. I think one of the things that wasn't very helpful in 2010 was that when we started out, with this very large program, things like digital services did not exist, 18F did not exist. We did have the first and second CIO, CTO work closely with Vivek Kundra, Anish Chopra, Todd Park, and Steve Van Rokel, but they really didn't have, they're the federal CIO, but they're not armed with 200 staff, to cover all the agencies. I think they might have a dozen or so people. So when they're trying to be helpful in terms of, streamlining, reporting, funding, lots of budget discussions and passbacks and going back and forth, it really slows down the process. I think in terms of looking at the partnership that you can immediately control between, let's say, OMB, two different sides of OMB, policy side and the eGov side, and then coordinate and come down through your department, which then has another set of bodies, governing bodies, from the Assistant Secretary for Finance and Resources to Public Affairs, and then it gets to the agency level, and then within the agency, it has to get to the program level. So, if this kind of partnership from top down was really well coordinated and aligned, I think when government undertakes these large projects, it could help quite a bit, rather than each individually coming down to the project level and expecting some answers, but no one above you is actually really coordinating or providing any real guidance.
Yeah, and I think to your point, it's that coordination of not the work itself, but the outcomes desired, right? And allowing the partners that are, enabling them to deliver an iterative factor towards those outcomes. But it's that alignment of outcomes from the top all the way down.
And I always looked at industry as a partner, and actually when I retired, I'd see guys and they said, yeah, I've worked with you and all that, and I go, yeah. He said, I was Lockheed, and I go, really? I thought you were a Blue Badger. I didn't even realize some of these folks were contractors, and that's the way I liked it, and I think that's the way they like it now. And I can speak to some of the companies that I've gone in, I tell them before you go in, they want to see you be successful because they want to be a success, and they need your help to tell them what the new capabilities are. And they're still pretty open-minded that way, at least they are out in West Virginia, to when I bring folks and said, hey, we appreciate it. And I said, you guys are like, I'm knocking on the door, you're messing with me. They go, no, we really do, because we need to know what industry is doing. We can't keep up with all this stuff and where it's going and how we can do our job better. So they were sincere about that and consider the IT community. We have a lot of partners. Obviously the state and local and tribal and other federal agencies are our partners, but even in the international community, but the IT community is part of our partners as well.
So speaking of success, with Agile being a journey and not a destination, what are some of the ways you have been able to measure success or measure progress? And what are some of the best practices you've used to communicate that across the organization? So Brian, I'll start off with you on that one.
So I think, of course, timelines and results, it's an easy way to respond to your question, but to go beyond that a little bit, and I think you maybe touched on it at the start, is that you're learning from the activities that you can have some repeatable processes. One of the things that I did in terms of on the way over is do a last minute check to see was there anything else new about Agile that changed in between whenever, I started out this morning in between, contract decisions and then coming here, because there's things that happen. But with that being said, I was really impressed to see that people were both further understanding one of the #1 successes with Agile across government is the utilization of identity management. In terms of if you have central identity management, not necessarily where every identity is in the same place, but a federated capability that allows us to do single sign-on to applications. And then from there, you can go all the way down to, if you want, enterprises, servers, microservices, or anything else. But just where if you want to choose outside of that identity management, then you have to show a serious reason for that justification. And there's times when it's acceptable, but it's acceptable to go outside of that identity management for a specific, stakeholder group. And I've seen, some really good successes both within DHS and across all of the federal civilian U.S. government, and just how they execute that. And I think an example is like even the HISN network of being able to communicate with first responders, but also when somebody doesn't have a common access card because there's a hurricane. Thanks.
I look at one thing as well, and since we're talking a little about people and process, one of the key things that I look at is happiness, right? And it's happiness at multiple levels, right? Internally, how happy are our team members? Do they feel like they have an aligned mission? Do they feel like they have a safe environment to iterate? Do they feel like they're contributing to the overall outcomes we're asking them to move forward on? And then externally, our customers, how happy are they? Do they feel like we're providing value? Do they feel like we're really their partners as well, kind of providing value in a much quicker manner? So if there was one kind of metric, I know it's kind of touchy-feely, right? But it's really that happiness that kind of, I think, kind of encompasses all these other things that kind of go in there as well.
I think my experience at CMS is a very implementation-focused organization. Healthcare has been debated and attempts to transform it. Every year I was at CMS, regardless of the administration or the legislature, something was always changing in a major way, and it'll continue to be that way for some time. So in following the kind of objectives and policies that are trying to reshape healthcare in this country, starting with Medicare, Medicaid, Marketplace, and Children's Health, you're typically given a deadline. That deadline is a politically driven deadline, not a deadline based upon a close analysis about how long it actually takes to do something. And it's not a bad thing. I think if you're trying to be agile and the data is a little squishy and fluid, it actually causes people to kind of get I think a little complacent. I think when you have this hard deadline you have to focus on and to deliver some set of capabilities, it forces you and it forces the people and the processes to make the right trade-offs in order to get to that minimum viable product. And so I think sometimes these deadlines are actually really good, especially if you're trying to realize the benefits and success of Agile. And of course, success in the agency I was in was, did you make the date? I don't care how it was, but you made the date.
And go ahead, Tom.
I've got the opposite side of that because, we didn't have it. And I remember the director coming into some of our meetings and he needed up to the date, up to the minute, officer-involved shooting, incidents involving officers when that was, such a big deal. And he comes out to CJIS because we have all the crime data. And they said, we don't have that. And that's not one of our categories. We don't track it. It's a year late when we do put it together, blah, blah, blah. So he said, well, I really need that. And they said, 5 years we can get you that. I'm like, 5 years? I said, you've got the director of the FBI asking this body and us collectively, why couldn't we be more agile than that? Why can't we deliver something in a much quicker fashion than that? That just, and then they said, well, maybe 3 years. I mean, give me a break. 3 years? That's not a collective to put on anyone's fault, but it was just, well, we got to gather this and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you're killing me. And I'm not the director, but I know what he's thinking. It's like, I came to these folks for help. 5 years, 3 years, that's not getting it.
Yeah, talk about the tail end of the process. One of the key challenges we had was convincing, well, actually we weren't successful convincing the security team to test increments of the system.
Yeah.
They had to have it all in a pristine environment for 5 straight days, all to themselves, in order to do their testing and to move to the next level towards an ATO.
Yep.
And so I think things have changed since then, which is good. But I think people have to realize that you can solve increments or kind of decompose pieces of the problem you're trying to solve. You don't have to hold on to the view of the world that everything has to move completely into your space before you can actually work on it.
I think in addition to agreeing to all the things everyone on this panel has mentioned, another thing worth sort of considering as a metric potentially of success of Agile within an agency or departmental context is across a portfolio, have you sort of seen a decline in shadow IT? Because that kind of gets to whether or not the products you're now deploying and developing are actually meeting the customer need. If you've rolled out a thing and they're still, doing their workarounds, which, let's be honest, they're around, that you're not necessarily addressing, even if you're meeting those timeline needs, you're not really deploying and utilizing or operationalizing products that meet the needs of your end customers. So I think that's another sort of outcome of an effective Agile organization, and I think that again drives from really making sure it's that end customer, that user-centeredness that gets into Agile, and in my mind is probably one of the most effective pieces of a good Agile process is incorporating that user.
Thank you. Can I add one last thing?
Absolutely.
And since we were kind of a maverick in, going to the cloud and putting critical applications there and driving Agile, it's simply because it was a kind of a survival mechanism. I found that you don't have to be a purist about Agile. You have to make Agile and your term, adaptive Agile. It's true in a sense. I think the complexity of your organization, the mission at hand, the delivery dates you have to meet. You have to really, really constantly, adapt, and it starts from the hosting environment, the network environment, your contracts, how your people kind of take responsibility and risk, in making sure that they can work on increments of the problem and buy into that. So I think a key is you don't want to be a methodologist, because a methodologist will just come and just kind of keep on beating the drum, as opposed to, let's change something about the way we do things, and maybe we can come back and maybe it'll be somewhere else the following week, but to be fluid.
Yeah, and again, I'm so jealous of you. But anyway, I think that's a key point, right? Because I think, again, I think being Agile and doing Agile are kind of different things, right? So again, it's not just about a methodology. Everyone does Scrum, everyone does Kanban.
It's the difference between thinking about having two daughters and having two daughters,
yes, right? Exactly. And it kind of comes down to common sense, right? You have to have common sense about the approach as well. But I think one of the key things is the ability to kind of inject into the agencies this want of being able to iterate and to continuously improve. I think that's super key beyond the methodologies.
And be happy.
And be happy, yes. Not jealous, happy.
All right, well, let's open it up to all of you to ask any questions that you may have. I see one in the back of the room here.
Hi. Hello? Okay. Hi, Derek Johnson with Federal Computer Week. This question is for Henry Chow. You had touched on this with some of your other comments, but you were obviously at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services during the initial healthcare.gov rollout. A GAO report came out afterwards that sort of partially pointed the finger at Agile, or more specifically, the government's inexperience operating in an Agile environment as one of the contributing factors to some of the failures that happened. I'm curious as to what lessons you've taken away from that experience, and what lessons has the government taken away about how to operate in an Agile environment?
Well, I think that specific GAO report was actually one of probably 4 or 5. The IG also was in-house. While we were doing this, we had 8 simultaneous audits going on while we're trying to build a system. It was very challenging, and really GAO and IG learned a lot, and we really kind of embraced them. So they really did see what was going on. And like I said, we were kind of really trying to drink the Kool-Aid on cloud computing, Agile, open source, reference models, and pushing that model. I think even if OMB and others didn't ask us to do it, we would have done it anyway. because remember, I said there's no. Did I say it? There's no money? There was,
Yeah, there was no money.
It took 2 years for a budget to actually come through because ACA was only funded with $1 billion, and Treasury and IRS took about 60% of that money. So I think it was an experimental stage, and since then, lessons have been learned to further look at the whole ecosystem, support ecosystem for delivery, and that comes from contracting to budgeting to how you even report. It was very interesting that in 2012, some of Steve Van Rokel's staff that kind of tracked the 300s from the agencies and the reporting about your portfolio performance, they came to me and said, we hear you're doing sprints. Can you report sprints as well? And I said, you want me to report at the portfolio level in the old way, and you want me to report, based on the sprints. I think they don't do that anymore. I think they are looking at, increments of build. It may be sprint, it may not be. And so I think those kind of factors that surround your ability to be successful, those things are changing.
Any additional questions?
I have one. Who likes my Star Wars socks?
I didn't want to stare, but
okay.
they're pretty cool.
Getting ready for the new one.
I think, one, from a perspective of a current government employee, and, of course, is always learning from the lessons from all the other government employees as much as I possibly can each day. But also from learning from the experiences from these large, corporations, including CA, is that I'm sure there's certain success factors that allow you to be able to expedite outside of government that you wish existed inside of government. But I would say with those wishes is to help ensure that the government, and not just one side of government, but all sides of government, becomes further aware of what that is and what that means. And even if there's one briefing done with one person at one department agency, that's one thing. But how can we further start to understand what enables corporations to be able to compete? What allows them to be able to perform and implement in certain periods of time? I'd be highly interested in understanding that, and I think there's other people across government who would also be interested in doing that, because we know that there's always an opportunity to do things better. We might not know exactly what that means, but it doesn't mean we're not open to the conversation. Thanks.
I just want to add one last thing. It kind of goes to kind of the interest area you're asking. I'm not going to say Agile saved us at the end of the day, but I think because we attempted and believed in Agile and scraping together every possible requirement to build an increment early, and it may not be an application level requirement. It may be just understanding how you're going to build infrastructure as a service and platform as a service in the cloud environment, to go ahead and proceed to do that. Because if you think about it, yes, the launch, I'll be the first one to admit that enrolling 6 people on the first day is horrible, right? Horrible performance, and was terrible user experience for lots of people. But you also have to remember that the system was beginning to enroll over 100,000 people a day within 60 days, with some help, of course. But because we built those increments early, absent of those application level requirements, we had a foundational aspect of which the mess and the fixes had to happen at the application level, and not necessarily digging all the way down, figuring out, is it a hosting problem, is it a network problem? We had those too, of course, but after the end of the first year, 7 million people were enrolled, and after the second year, 11 million people. So, it's a rocky start, but it did what it was intended to do. You just kind of, and it continues to be worked on, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing about increments that we just want to kind of ask folks to think about is that with an Agile mindset, it allows agencies to kind of really make those decisions of pivot or persevere much earlier versus kind of just persevere and suffer later on, right? Because it allows you to have good inflection points because you're tackling the riskiest things, you're delivering in increments, you're kind of learning and making some decisions along the way versus just kind of, boom, here it is, and let's fix it afterwards. So I think that's also a helpful benefit as well.
Tom, Laura, any closing thoughts before we wrap up? Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, Brian, Laura, Henry, James, Tom, for joining us. And I hope all the rest of you have a great rest of the afternoon. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Well done. Thank you.